Welcome everybody. My name is Dave Bailey and I want to thank you for joining us. This is Grief and Grace. There are so many different faces of grief, and so this Facebook Live was created to be one of the spaces helping to facilitate conversations around all of the myriad aspects of this common human experience. Conversations that we often don't have for a variety of reasons. And tonight my guest is Dr. Nancy Berns, who is a professor of sociology at Drake University. Her teaching and research interests are in the area of grief and death and violence, media, social constructionism, and social justice. And she is the author of the book Closure, The Rush to End Grief and What It Costs Us. Closure is such an overused word in the grief and loss space, and I think you'll find Dr. Berns's insights challenging and helpful. And if you have a question during the show, just put it in the comments and we'll take some time to answer as many as we can before we sign off. All right, Dr. Berns, thank you for being with us tonight.
Thank you, David. Great to be here and with all your viewers as well.
Thank you. Yeah, we've been working at putting this together for months, and I'm totally excited that we finally got a chance to do this. So why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself, the work that you do, and what led you to writing this book?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. So I have been doing research in the area of grief and death for the past 20 years. But prior to that, I was doing research on domestic violence and other types of crime and justice. So it was through my interest in justice, and particularly talking with murder victims' families, that I became more interested in grief. And then also, our firstborn son was stillborn, and that was almost 20 years ago. And so that personal experience with grief, which was devastating at the time,
yes,
right? Certainly helped me to want to explore grief even more. So it's an academic interest as well as a personal interest, and those merged quite beautifully, I think, and still do. And I followed in love with the topic of death and grief in terms of talking with people about it, and that's what I continue to do for my research.
Wow. Yeah, both my brother and my niece had experience with stillborn children that had come to full term and were stillborn, and I got to see firsthand the enduring nature of that, from that grief, So, yeah. So from your research, when did the concept of closure begin to enter the conversation around grief?
So when did I
No,
notice it and start to be interested in it, or in our
general?
culture?
In general,
In our culture?
because it's kind of a relatively new phenomenon. So when
Right.
did that whole idea that this is something that we really needed begin to become part of popular culture?
Right. So in the 1990s is when the concept of closure really started to become more popular. But 60s, 70s, and 80s, a lot of the social movements that were happening sort of set the stage for the 1990s in terms of using this idea of closure. So it became more popular first in the death penalty rhetoric, which is a chapter in the book that you had read. And it was used to defend or to change the rhetoric of death penalty politics. And from there, it started to be used in other situations, so other movements, and then also the funeral industry began to pick it up to talk about grief. So it took off then in the 1990s in a lot of different directions.
Interesting. And you talk about in the book, which is a fantastic book, by the way. Thank you. Yes. You talk about 6 different ways that people use to talk about what closure is or what closure does. You talk about closing a chapter, remembering, forgetting, getting even, knowing, confessing, or forgiving. Can you walk us through those, and how might some of those ways be helpful and not so helpful with this whole idea that there is this magical, mystical place called closure?
Yeah, sure. So closure is this concept that's been constructed. So there isn't an actual thing that is closure. It's a way that we talk about things. So it's also why it's become such a popular word or popular concept in politics as well as commercialization, because you can make it fit whatever narrative you want.
Yes.
So there is no one definition for closure, and that's why people can use it. It's interesting. I always encourage my students. I said, if people start using the word closure, just ask them, what is it that you mean by that? And a
Yes.
lot of times people aren't sure what they mean by that. They've just heard it a lot or think that's something you need. So sometimes people are using it to define a very specific thing. So if I finally know what happened in a situation, or I have a specific question answered, then maybe they have closure to that.
Mm.
But a lot of times it's just a very general, vague concept. And what I found in my research is that people tend to use it to talk about other people's pain more so than their own.
Wow,
So to
interesting.
say, yes, right. So to say, I think you need closure on this, on your grief or on your breakup. Well, it's used a lot with breakups. But when people tend to be in the pain themselves, I think a lot of times they understand this isn't so simple that you can just wrap it up and set it aside
Yes.
as closure might mean to them. So, what I find is a harmful part about closure is the baggage that comes with it.
Mm.
So, when people are using that word, they're not quite sure what it means, right? So, it's not clear. But then when people hear it, a lot of times what they're hearing is, you want me to close my grief, you want me to
Yes.
close my pain, you want me to set it aside. And they're often not ready to do that.
You want me to
And
get on with
it's,
life as though this didn't happen.
yes, right, exactly. And so instead, what they might do is shut down or isolate or just at least withdraw from that one person. So it's not that it couldn't be helpful if it was maybe more specific in our language, but it's not. And it tends to be used just to try and get people to end their grieving quicker.
Mm. We get uncomfortable with other people's emotional state. And we're like, if you could possibly deal with this, I'd feel better about myself.
Right,
So
right.
let me read you a quote from your book to just pick up with that idea that you had there. You said, closure is not some naturally occurring emotion that we can simply find with the right advice. Rather, closure is a made up concept, a frame used to explain how we should respond to loss. And then you talk about the idea of how society provides feeling rules that people are expected to conform to. And I'd like you to take as much time as you want to just
Okay.
unpack the whole concept of feeling rules, how that impacts the spectrum of grief. Because for me, that was one of the amazing concepts in your book. So, yeah, feeling rules.
Yeah, sure. So there's this wonderful literature, the sociology of emotion, that really helps us understand emotions and how we interact with each other based on our understanding of emotion. So Arlie Hochschild is a sociologist who has developed and written about the concept of feeling rules. So I'm building on her work there to help us understand then what does this mean for closure. So feeling rules are they're these informal ideas of how we think we should feel about something. Now, how we actually feel doesn't always meet up with those feeling rules. And so sometimes we think we're supposed to feel a certain way, but we don't. And then that can cause a lot of tension for ourselves. We might be questioning ourselves, what's wrong with me? Why do I not feel the way I think I'm supposed to feel? Or it might lead us to question other people if we think other people aren't living up to these feeling rules. So it can create a lot of conflict, and it's a small part of our larger social expectations. And I think what's really difficult about grieving, well, there's a lot of difficult things about grieving, right? But one of the things is that we spend so much time dealing with the weight of social expectations that we don't always just are able to take time to actually think, how do I feel? How do I really
Yes.
feel? I'm worried so much maybe about what other people think I should feel, and then maybe why I don't feel that way. And that gets very confusing. And that's not so much a grieving process as it is trying to sort through the social expectations. So one of my missions and what I love to talk about with people is trying to give people the freedom to grieve, right? Give people the freedom to feel the way they feel, to talk about it if they want, to not talk about it if they want, to feel differently in different situations, and to not feel paralyzed by these feeling rules.
So much to unpack in
Yeah, and we can unpack any of that.
yes, so much. Just as you were talking, I got to thinking about a friend of mine who her parents had 3 daughters, 3 sons, had a son that was killed in a traffic accident when he was 17. Then a few years later, just as they were transferring to take a new job in Florida, they had a 22-year-old son that was killed in a tobogganing accident. Married, little boy, and so the organization that he was working with gave him 2 weeks off, and then moved him to Florida. He got to work, and his boss came down to visit him, and they're driving around in the car, and he literally said to him, "So, are you over it yet?" And
Yes.
I'm like, how did he not do serious bodily harm to him? Like, we just have no, yeah, here's my social expectations. You need to be over it already.
Right. It's really amazing sometimes what people will say to each other. And I think one of the reasons that people ask that, are you over it, or are you, back to normal, whatever way they're trying to phrase that. I think part of it is they want this easy answer because then it helps to feel like, okay, should I ever have to face something even close to that difficult? I want to know that there's a way out, and there's a way out pretty quickly.
Oh, that's
And that's what I mean. Yeah, that's what I mean by a lot of times people use closure to talk about other people's pain. It's not only that we are not in good practice sitting with each other's pain, but it's scary to watch that and to imagine what would that be like if it happened to me, and I want to know exactly. And then when people are in it and they're deep in it, they understand this is more complicated than that. You don't just get over it,
yes,
and that's also not what's helpful.
yes, yeah. One of my guests, dear friend of mine, Dr. Bruce Sanguin, when and he's going to be back on the show next week, but we were talking, and we were exploring the idea that people are often grief illiterate. We don't have the vocabulary, and we don't have the permission to grieve. I love when you said, part of your goal is to give people freedom to grieve. So when you talk about feeling rules, just expand this a little bit more for us. What are some of the feeling rules that people tend to give other people?
Right. Well, and a lot of times people are doing it to themselves too.
Yes.
Yeah,
True.
I want to make that clear too, because we can be our own harshest critic.
Yes.
So for example, I was interviewing a mom, and when I was interviewing her, it had been 5 years since her son had died, and he was in his 20s at the time. And one of the things that she was having a hard time with was the fact that she never felt angry.
Wow,
and she was telling me that, and she said to me, "What's wrong with me? I was never angry." And I said to her, "There's nothing wrong with you. Just some people aren't angry. Other people are angry. There's not one right way to do that." And for her and for many people, this comes from one of the most popular misconceptions of grief, which is the 5 stages.
Yes.
There aren't stages to grief that people go through, and that's not backed up by research. That people don't follow the same path, and they don't have the same expectations. So feeling angry is sometimes one thing that people expect. We see this, the others, and it can be difficult, like within a family or among friends. If one side is angry about something, but a loved one is not angry, then they
Yes.
wonder, did you not love them enough? Why are you not grieving? And that can be really difficult too on those relationships. Am I sad enough? Right? That might be something people are asking themselves. Within families, just the way people act, and for how long.
Yes.
And there's you mentioned, with your friend and going back to work after so long. For some people, that's a very helpful thing. And for other people, it's not.
Yes.
But no matter what you do, you might have somebody in your life who are saying, should you be working already? Or why are you not going back to work?
Yes. Well,
right?
people get caught in this vice. They get caught between their in-laws here, their mother-in-law there, their parents here, their siblings there, and everyone's got a different expectation of this is how you should be dealing with your grief.
Right. And gender expectations can play a big role in feeling rules. Yes. So a lot of times the stereotypes that we have for men and women that, are based in misconceptions of how men and women are actually feeling and how their emotions do work, but that does affect then grieving. So one stereotype is that, men shouldn't be as talkative about it. They shouldn't be as emotional, meaning when we say emotional, we mean they shouldn't cry.
Yes.
They shouldn't talk about it. But there are men who that would be helpful for them. They would want to talk about it. They would want to feel comfortable crying, and that could be a really good thing, not just for them, but those around them.
Yes.
For women, go ahead.
Okay, no, finish that off. With women.
Oh, and for women, sometimes it's the expectation that they would cry more, that they would talk more. And there are plenty of women who, for whatever different reasons, aren't criers, or certainly not in public, or not around other people.
Yes.
And that's fine. But they are fighting the feeling rule, which is that women should show those emotions more. So then there's just a lot of extra layers there from these feeling rules, from these stereotypes that complicate how we're grieving that wouldn't need to be there.
So what simple piece, if there is a simple piece of advice, would you give to someone who is hyper aware that there's an enormous amount of internal feeling rules that they're imposing on themselves, like, I need to be strong, or I can't cry in public, or whatever those feeling rules are, and external feeling rules? What would you say to someone who all of a sudden they're listening to this tonight and they're becoming aware, like, oh, I never had vocabulary for that, but that's exactly right. There's an enormous amount of rules happening around me. What would you say to them?
For the person who's grieving?
Yes.
Well, everyone grieves differently. Every individual has a unique journey in their grieving. And if you think about it, we love differently, our lives are differently, all of our relationships are different.
Yes.
So it makes sense that we would grieve differently. We grieve because we love, right? And so the differences in our relationships, in our lives, in where we're at and who we are, that's reflected in the differences in grieving too. So the best that you can is to try and allow yourself room to explore that grieving journey.
Interesting.
And it's okay not to try and tell everyone that. You don't owe people that education.
Yes.
If you feel up to it, you could share that with people. But that becomes a big weight too. And so another thing I would say is even sometimes just one person who's a great listener for you, that you can talk or vent the way you want to.
Yes.
Sometimes that can be enough at times. So it's not that everyone around you has to understand what you're going through. If you can find one or two or a small group of people who you are comfortable just being you, then that's fabulous.
Yes. Yeah. And it's being aware. It's being aware whether you're being authentic or whether you're feeling like you're having to live up to other people's expectations about it. Yeah. My guest last week was Michelle Hernandez from Soaring Spirits International. She said something that was so profound. Grief is not a problem that needs to be fixed. I love that.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And yet, you talk about how, in the book, it talks about how traumatic grief and prolonged grief have not just been a therapeutic diagnoses, they've actually become mental health diagnoses, as though the grief of losing a child in a homicide or whatever might have an ending to it, and if that grief went on for a long time, somehow there's a mental health issue to that.
Right. And this might get some controversy on your show, right? It's saying that, but I do think it's such an important distinction. And I'm not the only voice out there by far, right? This is a hotly contested debate about whether grieving belongs as part of a mental health syndrome. So I think it's a mistake that we lump grieving with other mental illnesses, because people who are grieving may be struggling with a mental health concern. That's possible, and absolutely we would want them to seek some help for some of their mental health struggles, but that we want to separate that from grief. And it's tricky because grieving can have so many of the same symptoms and so many of the same behaviors as other mental illnesses. So it can be tempting maybe to see those as the same thing. But you can be grieving and be struggling with a mental health concern.
Yes.
What I think in the bigger picture, not just for helping people understand that, but just our cultural way of thinking about grief, is what's been happening over the years is that we're losing this idea of grief as normal.
Yes.
Grief is a normal response to loss, and we have losses throughout our life. And even more than that, I think that it's important to understand that grieving is beneficial. And so if we're short-circuiting that process of grieving, then people aren't able to benefit from the actual process of grieving. So those are my concerns of if we turn it into a mental health condition, we privatize that, we medicalize it, we isolate people, we make them feel like this is an individual problem and that they need to get over it as soon as possible. Otherwise, it becomes a sickness or pathology.
Yes.
And I think that's not only misleading, but it's counterproductive. Certainly, there are people who are grieving and who have a lot of layers of complications going on, and people who do need additional help. I mean, so that's absolutely true. But let's separate those and talk about them as different issues that are related, but they're still different.
Yes. I love the way that you phrased it. You said grief is complicated and it's normal.
Yes.
And I think just that simple concept alone, grief is complicated and it's normal. Yeah.
Right.
Let me read you a quote you have in the book from Frank Ochberg. I always feel a little strange reading an author their own book, but
no, that's great. Go ahead.
He's a psychiatrist specializing in traumatic stress, and he said, "You don't get closure on trauma, on tragedy, on the impact of human cruelty, but you do grow. You do get sadder and wiser, and you do more often than not get the opportunity to help fellow travelers. Closure is a myth, but progress is not." I love that. So, when people use the word closure, maybe it's because it's the only word that they have, and they're trying to describe something they're searching for, maybe even desperate for. What insight or concept would you offer as an alternative that doesn't, in your words, rush to end grief in a way that isn't helpful or healthy?
Yes, and I'm gonna answer that, but I'm gonna back up just a little bit for some context to that.
Okay.
So I think that because I know just from other many times that I do talk about, I'll say closure doesn't exist, and I always want to make sure, I clarify that I'm not saying that the pain that people feel, from grief, particularly in those early times, will never get better. So that's not what I'm saying.
Yes.
What I'm saying is you don't need closure to heal. Right? You don't need to wrap up all the pain before you're living again.
Yes.
So it's not that the pain won't get better. It's again going back to that language. So you're asking, what other language could we use? And I think learning to live with loss can be helpful. You're learning to live with it. And again, this is there are many other researchers and advocates who will use similar language, learning to live with loss, finding meaning. So it's about that process. But the trauma that happens to us, we can't just forget it. We don't just get over it.
Yes.
It is a part of us. So I think it's about carrying it. And if you think about, like, if you have a really heavy backpack, you can do different things, right, to lighten that load. I mean, one is you can try and take some things out of the backpack. So if whether it's on your own or with professional help or just with friends, if there are things you can unload about the trauma in terms of how you're carrying that, then that might lighten the load some, but it's still going to be part of you.
Yes.
And that doesn't have to be seen as a bad thing. So what happens can be bad, but it can also shape people and deepen their compassion and strengthen people and help them connect with humanity even more. So another way that we can lighten a heavy backpack is by shifting the way we carry it, right? So if you think about how you adjust backpacks or something heavy, just the way you position it on your body, then it becomes easier to carry. And so we want to think about the grief, the pain, the trauma. How do I remember it? How do I think about it? How do I carry it? So that's I think the concept, the perspective, and maybe even some language that I find more useful when talking with people as opposed to closure.
Yes.
Closure has often this finality to it. And if they like the word closure, if they find it appealing, then I would certainly want to ask them why, and just have them share with me. And that certainly, helps us to understand them, what it is that they're seeking.
Yeah, what is it you're looking for? I personally came away from reading your book with a whole new way of framing my experience of grief over the loss of my dad. And I'd go for long walks listening to the book and thinking and pondering and then coming back and opening it and reading and rather than closure, I for myself began to think of grief as a story with many chapters, and each of those chapters might bring some resolution, of thoughts or of emotions or of questions, but each chapter is like a cliffhanger that leads to the next and to the next and to the next. And what makes the story, is pondering this, what makes the story of grief different than other stories is there's never a page that says the end. My loss will never change, so my grief will always be real. But for me, in my experience, 5.5 years, as each chapter has unfolded, there's come a deepening of love and a deepening of appreciation for his life that I could never have anticipated. And the story goes on. I know there's an unending amount of chapters still to be written. The one thing that it's helped me, I've sat with families that I'm helping, since I work in the death care industry, families that I'm helping that have lost their dad, kids that have lost their dad. I say to them, I know that you love your dad today in ways that you can't imagine that you could ever love him more than you do. But I promise you, a year from now, 3 years from now, 5 years from now, that love will be so deeper and richer. And they look at me like, really? I'm like, yeah, really. Just tuck that away, because that's going to happen. So thank you.
Yeah, that's a great way, to share that with them. And, in your example of a story, and what makes a story great is we have those threads, right? We have those parts of the story that are woven throughout it.
Yes.
And, your dad is part of you.
Yes.
Right. So it would make sense that you would carry that, and that
yes.
would, his love and what you learn from him and your memories. And along with that's going to come some sadness and grief.
Yes, of course.
Right? And that's
And it is living with loss. I like the way that you said that. It's living with loss.
Right.
My loss is never going to change. Dad's never coming back, you know? And so you live with it, but you find a little resolution, and a little resolution. A friend of mine says, there is no closure, there's only a lot of little closings. And I thought that was, yeah.
And I might help in thinking about that just another way. I mean, and again, with language, that's one of the beautiful things about language and our differences is that the way one person thinks about it, it might be different from someone else, but that can work for them. I think one of the things that happens when you're so close to a death in time, right, that it hasn't happened too long ago, a lot of times what you remember and what you think about is connected to the death more.
Yes.
But particularly if it was traumatic, sudden, violent, and it takes some time to where you start to remember more of the person's life.
Yes, brilliant.
And I think, so in some ways, with time, there are also more openings. So with a death, sometimes we feel like that door is slammed shut, and we just so desperately want to open that door so we can get back to before.
Yes.
Right? I want to go back to before. I don't know this world around me without this person in my life, and I just want to go back.
Yes.
And we're pounding at that door, trying to get it open. And what happens in time, and this varies for people how long it takes, and that's okay. There's no one time schedule.
Yes.
But what happens with time is that we begin to see the windows, and we begin to, we can't get back to the before the way it was, but we begin to see more clearly what it was like, what we had, the lessons we still carry with us, and we always get to keep that love.
Yes.
So, but that takes some time because we can be so deep in grief or trauma, and again, that's going to vary for people, but there are more openings down the road too.
Wow, I love that. I love that. We start to see the windows.
Yes.
Wow, that's brilliant. So let me ask you one last question. You've been so gracious to come and be with us tonight and share your time. And I know that between the university and all this work that you do, you're a busy person, and so I'm extraordinarily thankful. But I always like to end sort of with this question, or a variation on this question. What is the most important thing that you would like to say to us about grief?
Well, I've mentioned that everyone grieves differently, which I do think is really important. So I would add to that is that you can carry love and joy along with grief, and you can carry those together. So I think one of the misconceptions we have about emotions is that you can only carry one emotion at a time, and that's just not true.
Yes.
We're created to be complicated.
Yes.
We're created to carry all sorts of emotions, and so for people who are grieving, it's okay when you start to feel joy again.
Yes.
You can carry those together. You don't have to feel bad about that. When they see other people who have joy, that doesn't mean they're not also sad or grieving. And so if we can give ourselves and others the space to carry the joy and grief together, then that opens up some room for the love.
Wow.
And for people who are supporting others, don't be afraid to give them space to grieve.
Yes. Because
I think that's what helps them have room to also feel the love. But we can't, if we're bottling people's grief up, then they don't have room to be open to the love and joy that still remain.
Yes.
So it's okay to feel all those complicated emotions at once. That's how we're created.
Yeah, brilliant. All right. The book is Closure, The Rush to End Grief and What It Costs Us. You can find it on nancyberns.com, and I think you can also find it on Amazon.
Yes.
I got it on Kindle, so I bought it on Audible and on Kindle. So I'm a two-time offender. But it was brilliant. It was brilliant for me to be able to listen and ponder and come back and read and underline and listen and ponder and come back and underline. So I encourage you, if you're watching and you've been thinking about this and things that we've said tonight has kind of hooked you, you want to just really think that through. Please take advantage of Dr. Berns's book. Thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, thank you, David. It's been great having this conversation with you.
Thank you.